Yeah, hi folks. Now in my last video I covered one fundamental flaw with the Outdoors and Freedom Party, and today I'll cover the other. Now I'm bringing this video forward as it is very pertinent in respect to current media news content, except on Ardern's communist media, that is. Anyway, let's get started.
We spoke just last week to a Dutch farmer about the unrealistic emissions targets that the government has set and how they will decimate the agricultural industry in the Netherlands, which is the world's second largest agricultural exporter.
So let's go and see the clip he was referring to, and I'll come back to this clip later.
Last week in the Netherlands, Klaus Schwab's golden pin-up boy, Prime Minister Mark Rutte, is busy fulfilling the agenda of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset by turfing farmers off their own land because bureaucrats deem there's too much nitrogen in the soil. Ooh, this is the Great Reset that I've been warning you about for months, if not years, on this show. My thanks to Rebel News for these clips.
In the existing Next-Gen EU fund, there is still a lot of money, which is also partly funneled towards greening our economies, and that's exactly what we need to do to become less gas and oil dependent.
Where do you find still such a prime minister in the world? You find it in the Netherlands, and it's Mark Rutte.
If they're going to do everything that they want, if they want to go to the goal, they're going to reduce 50% of the farmers here in Holland.
Sure.
And that's only the farming, but the truck drivers is going to come down, industry is going to come down, mechanics is going to come down, everything is going down.
At the same time, people are aware that the climate is changing, and that we need to step up our collective efforts to make sure that we counter that and that
Except Communist China, of course.
to mitigate it.
Disgraceful. Last week I also mentioned the crazy climate policies in Sri Lanka where the army are brought in to stop ordinary workers getting gasoline. And this morning, as I said, we learned that Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been forced to flee as protesters surround his residence.
And I'll cover that story in a moment.
More madness caused entirely by the climate cult implementing climate change policies. No other reason. We're also now getting reports that Italian farmers are rising up to protest in Rome. Quote, they are saying, "We are not slaves, we are farmers. We cannot make ends meet." But it's not just Italian farmers. Polish farmers are now protesting. So too are Spanish farmers, as too are disgruntled German farmers. This is taking place everywhere, and you can slate it all home to insane globalist climate change policies. Indeed, Germany's largest landlord, wait for it, will be reducing heating for tenants in order to save energy, according to Reuters. I've lived in Germany. It's bloody cold, I can tell you. This, as I say, is the Great Reset in action. In the Netherlands, the proposals include a map displaying areas where up to 95% reduction in nitrogen in the soil by 2030 is required, with entire regions facing 70% reduction targets. Joining us now from the Netherlands is Wietse Sonnema, from the Netherlands Agriculture and Horticultural Organization. Wietse, great to see you. How are you? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good, thank you. Good morning.
Now, explain to us, Wietse, what is going on in Holland, why these insane policies, and why the farmers and the organization you represent are speaking up.
There's a broad sense of frustration, anger, even despair amongst farmers at the moment. And it's not about sustainability per se. We're amongst the most sustainable producers in the world, maybe the most sustainable producers. But as you mentioned, there's a map now outlining nitrogen reduction targets of 50% nationally, 70 up to 95% in certain areas. And imagine if you're a fifth generation farmer living on your land, making a living, being part of a local community.
Being part of a local community. Now that is exactly what Sue Gray preaches, but their policies will destroy them just like this.
And you see a map saying there's basically no future. No future for farming, but also no future for the economic, social, cultural fabric of the countryside. Well, that's what happened here, and that leads to these kind of pictures of protests in the street.
Yeah, anyway, now to Sri Lanka.
Agriculture was once the backbone of Sri Lanka's economy. It made up a huge chunk of the GDP, and not to mention employed a quarter of the population. But then came the organic campaign. Farmers were pushed into abandoning chemical fertilizers overnight. The result was disastrous, the effects which are still being felt all over the island.
It's another day in the field for these farmers. The sun beating down, the muddy waters splashing against their legs. Until recently, these farmers were the backbone of Sri Lanka's economy. Agriculture made up 7.4% of the GDP, employed a quarter of the population, and not to mention brought in valuable foreign exchange. Then came Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The new president had a thought. What if Sri Lankan agriculture became 100% organic? No chemical fertilizers. No pesticides. 100% organic. Rajapaksa ran with the plan. Overnight, he banned all chemical fertilizers.
Even experts rejected it. These experts, including professors, advised against full dependency on organic fertilizer. The farmers also clearly expressed their disapproval. But despite the opposition, the government went ahead and imposed strict rules and forced it on us. And in the end, it failed.
Failure is putting it lightly. The organic turn was a monumental disaster. They were literally nudged off a cliff. The result? Output fell dramatically.
When we used chemical fertilizer, we were able to get a yield of about 3,000 kilograms per acre. But since we switched to organic farming, we have received only about half that yield, about 1,500 kilograms or less.
And besides the Greens, etc., the Outdoors Party will also nudge New Zealand off the cliff. Now, folks, I pre-recorded this yesterday. Outdoors and Freedom Party. Harmonise with policies in our premium markets so we don't erode our reputation. We risk non-tariff barriers in overseas countries when banned chemicals are detected offshore. We can't afford to allow weak regulations that permit chemicals banned in Europe in our produce, so we need to align with European decisions on hazardous substances. We need to align with European decisions. But hey, we're not globalists. We will adopt these 2020 policy measures. A reduction by 50% of the use and risk of chemical pesticides and the use of more hazardous pesticides by 50% by 2030. A reduction of nutrient losses by at least 50% while ensuring that there is no deterioration in soil fertility. This will reduce the use of fertilizers by at least 20% by 2030. A reduction by 50% of the sales of antimicrobials for farmed animals and in aquaculture by 2030. But this last one here, folks, is a real doozy. and reaching 25% of agricultural land under organic farming by 2030. That's just under 7.5 years' time.
But here's the thing. The reality is this is not an isolated incident. And while the ambitions of the global elites pushing radical environmental and economic agendas has grown in recent years, happily, so too has the pushback. We've seen it in growing protests over the past weeks from farmers across Europe. The overthrow of the Sri Lankan government, which, remember, wanted to turn the whole island into an organic paradise. And this, even as far back as a surprise vote, at least for the elites, in favor of Brexit, and for Donald Trump in 2016. Now, this guest, I'm so excited that he's come to join us tonight. Ralph Schoellhammer is an assistant professor in economics and political science at Webster University in Vienna, and he has written a fantastic piece on the working class revolt, and he joins us now. Professor Schoellhammer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And they do say that flattery is the highest form of intimidation, so consider me thoroughly intimidated.
Fantastic. Now, you've written this great piece in Newsweek, and one of the things that you talk about here is that there is a malaise in the West currently, and you say that ideological goals of the elites are being...
The ideological goals of the elites are
pursued at the expense of the...
Are being pursued at the expense of...
Lower middle class and working classes.
The lower middle class and working classes. Now, that is exactly what the Outdoors Party is doing.
And you see truckers in Canada rebelling against this, farmers in the Netherlands. You see people rebelling against this in the United States in different ways. You see what's happening in Germany, where they've shut off the nuclear plants for whatever reason and now are going to go into a very cold winter in just a few months. They're gratifying the elites, you write, while immiserating the working class. Tell us what is happening here. Tell us why the elites are doing this, but also what is the pushback that's happening?
I mean, I think this is a larger trend. You already mentioned, Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, and those were already symptoms of that pushback. But the situation we find ourselves in, I would say it consists of 4 different groups, right? One group is the activists. I mean, those are the people who really believe that the end of the world is around the corner, and they're overrepresented in media, in academia, and in the cultural sphere. Then you have the governments and politicians, and what they do is they like to virtue signal to those people because they believe, right? Most of them are on Twitter. They're very active on Twitter. They believe that they represent a huge chunk of the population. And then you have companies who want to make a profit off of it, right? For example, I don't believe that Unilever cares particularly about the environment, but it's something they have to say because they wanted to pander to a specific clientele. So you have a kind of a Bermuda Triangle of ideology that consists of those 3 groups. And the quote unquote, when I mean, the working class or the middle class, you could also call them the people who just pay their taxes and want to live their lives, like people who don't spend a lot of time on social media. They're trapped in this because it's more and more encroaching on their daily lives. I mean, you just mentioned it, right? In Germany, to leave nuclear energy behind was a purely political, ideological position. And the people were told, oh, don't worry, we're going to replace it with wind, we're going to replace it with solar. Now it turns out that's not going to work, and they will get poorer. And I think this is part of this. They realize now that they accepted the eccentric ideas of their elites to the extent that they did not believe that it will have a negative effect on their life.
Buyer beware, folks. Now, folks, I don't know how the Outdoors Party can say they are for freedom while forcing organic farming into New Zealand at the same time. That is not freedom. High food prices is not freedom. Being anti-farmer is not freedom. That is Green Party elitism.